Whispers at the window, tonight's bedtime story, a sleep story, a relaxing story, and a guided sleep meditation from Midnight Murmurs Radio. I am Evelyn Blackwood, and as the rain drifts softly across the old town of Waverly Hollow, I invite you to settle in, breathe slowly, and let your thoughts fade into the quiet rhythm of the storm. Somewhere beyond your window, the world grows still, and only the sound of rain remains gentle, endless, and alive with secrets. Take a slow breath in through your nose and release it through your lips. Let your shoulders fall. Let your heartbeat find the same calm tempo as the raindrops against the glass. Tonight, we travel to a house that has watched 70 years of rain, its windows whispering to those who listen long enough. As you lie there, imagine the dim golden light of a single lamp glowing beside you, its warmth flickering against the dark. The scent of rain seeps through the half-open window, carrying with it the hush of the pines, the smell of wet earth, and a faint echo of the past. This story begins on such a night when the rain had been falling for hours and the sound had turned from weather into music. On Willamere Road stood an old colonial house, its paint faded, its roof bowed by time. Inside, an elderly woman named Mrs. Delaney sat by the window, wrapped in a shawl of deep blue wool. She had lived there all her life, and though the house was quiet now, she often said it still breathed. Sometimes, when the rain grew heavy and the glass trembled, she could hear it, a faint whisper, like a voice pressed against the pane. Some nights, she thought it said her name, Eleanor. It was not frightening. Not anymore. It was familiar, as if the house remembered her better than the people who had long forgotten. Tonight, however, the whisper came earlier than usual. She looked up from her knitting, her hands slowing, the yarn slipping silently from her lap. The window fogged over, and for a brief second she saw what looked like the outline of a hand, small, childlike, pressing from the outside. She rose, her cane tapping softly against the wooden floor, and approached the window. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice a blend of curiosity and fatigue. The whisper stopped. The rain grew louder, 1,000 soft voices falling together. Then, faintly, came the sound of humming, a lullaby, the one her mother used to sing before the war, before the house had lost its laughter. The tune floated just beyond the glass, as though someone stood in the garden, swaying in the rain. But when Mrs. Delaney peered out, there was only the reflection of her own face and the silver shimmer of water pouring from the eaves. She touched the pane, and the cold reached through to her bones. Behind her, the grandfather clock ticked, slow and patient. Each sound of its pendulum echoed like a heartbeat in the hollow rooms. And then, somewhere upstairs, a door creaked open. Though she lived alone, her lips parted slightly, not in fear, but in recognition. "It's you again," she whispered, and smiled faintly, as if greeting an old friend. The window seemed to shimmer, and for a moment the reflection in the glass was no longer hers. A younger face looked back, eyes bright, hair undone, lips curved in the soft astonishment of memory. She closed her eyes, listening as the humming faded back into the rain. Outside, the town of Waverly Hollow slept beneath the storm. unaware that one house, just beyond the curve of the lake, had begun to remember. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The rain did not stop that night. It slid down the windows like slow-moving tears, pooling on the stone sill and tracing faint paths that caught the light. From Telam, Mrs. Delaney had fallen asleep in her chair, her knitting half finished beside her, the soft blue yarn tangled around her wrist like a dream that refused to end. The house creaked with the weight of wind and time, its old beams sighing in the rhythm of the storm. From somewhere deep within the walls came a faint tapping, not the steady dripping of rain, but something lighter, deliberate, almost like a fingertip brushing wood. She stirred, eyes fluttering open, unsure if the sound had been part of her dream. For a moment, everything was still. Then the whisper returned, softer this time, closer. It didn't come from the window now, it came from the hall. Her breath caught the air inside the house, felt thicker, carrying the scent of damp linen and something older, faintly metallic, like the echo of rust or forgotten keys. She reached for her cane, the tip of it sliding across the worn rug as she rose. "All right," she murmured, voice trembling only from age. "Let's see what you want tonight." She moved slowly through the narrow hallway, the light behind her shrinking into a golden square on the floor. Portraits of her ancestors lined the walls, stern faces framed in gilt, their eyes deep with secrets. When she was a child, her mother told her those portraits sometimes whispered, too, when the rain was heavy enough. She paused by one, her great-grandfather, Captain Jeremiah Delaney, who had sailed the Atlantic before vanishing one winter. The glass over his portrait glistened with condensation, and then she saw it. Not her reflection this time, but a faint movement behind the painted eyes, as if someone were breathing inside the frame. Her cane trembled in her hand. "Jeremiah? Jeremiah?" she whispered, almost amused by her own daring. The eyes in the portrait flickered just once before settling again into stillness. She smiled, weary, resigned, and continued on. The tapping had become more insistent now, leading her toward the narrow staircase that wound upward into darkness. Each step creaked softly beneath her weight. Halfway up, she paused and listened. Their child's laughter, light and fleeting, drifted through the air like a breeze from another century. It was the same laughter she used to hear from her little brother, Thomas, before he disappeared during the flood of 27. She hadn't thought of that day in years, yet now every raindrop outside seemed to echo his name. When she reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched long and dim, lined with doors that hadn't been opened in decades. The tapping stopped. Only the clock downstairs kept its rhythm, distant and calm. Mrs. Delaney hesitated before the first door on the left, her brother's old room. The brass handle was cold beneath her hand. She turned it slowly, and the hinges groaned like a sigh. Inside, the room was as it had been 70 years ago, the small iron bed, the desk by the window, the faded wallpaper patterned with ships and clouds. Dust floated in the air like pale ghosts, catching the faint silver light of the storm outside. She stepped closer to the window, her reflection wavering on the glass. "Thomas," she whispered, "is that you?" And then, faintly, the glass fogged from within, a small handprint appearing just as before. This time, it lingered. The whisper that followed was unmistakable. A child's voice, low and clear. "Don't be afraid, Ellie." Her heart stopped. No one had called her that in decades. The handprint slowly faded, leaving behind only the rhythm of rain. She sank into the chair by the window, tears mingling with the moisture on her cheeks. "I never was," she said softly. "I just wanted to know where you went." The storm grew heavier, as if answering her. The room seemed to breathe, the wallpaper trembling with every gust. Downstairs, the clock struck midnight, 12 long, hollow chimes rolling through the house. With the last echo, the whisper ceased, and all that remained was the steady sigh of the rain. Mrs. Delaney closed her eyes. For the first time in many years, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Not fear, but the strange, tender weight of being remembered. The clock's final chime lingered like a ripple in still water, fading into the soft murmur of rain. Mrs. Delaney remained in the chair, her eyes heavy, her fingers resting on the windowsill as though she could still feel the warmth of that vanished hand. Outside, the lake lay hidden beneath a veil of mist, its dark surface trembling with raindrops. Somewhere across the water, a train passed, its low whistle carrying through the valley, a lonely sound, old as memory itself. She used to love that sound when she was a girl, before the war came, before her brother disappeared. They would watch the trains together, counting the sparks in the night, imagining where they might lead. But that was long before the flood, before the Delaney family name became a quiet echo in Waverly Hollow. She sighed, this sound barely audible over the rain. "Thomas," she whispered again, but no answer came. Instead, from the corner of the room, a soft glow began to bloom, faint, bluish, like light reflecting off water. It moved slowly along the floorboards, shimmering as it went. Mrs. Delaney blinked, uncertain whether it was a trick of her weary eyes. But then she heard it, the soft hum of a lullaby, the same tune she'd heard earlier, the one her mother used to sing when the world outside was too cruel to bear. The glow gathered near the small wooden desk, illuminating an object that hadn't been there before. An old journal, its leather cover damp and warped. She leaned forward, her joints aching as she reached for it. The initials D were faintly engraved on the front. Her heart tightened. "Thomas Delaney," she breathed. She hadn't seen this since the summer of 1927, the year of the storm, the year he vanished. She opened it slowly. The pages inside were yellowed, edges curled with time, yet the ink was still legible, neat, careful handwriting, a child's attempt to make his words last forever. She began to read aloud, her voice trembling with age and wonder. July 14th, 1927, Turin. Asante stopped for days. Mama says the river is angry. I think it's sad. Sometimes I hear it crying at night, like it wants to come inside. She turned another page. July 15th. Ellie says not to sit by the window when it storms, but I can hear someone calling from the water. It sounds like Papa. He says he found a ship under the lake, one that sank before we were born. She looked up startled, her eyes reflecting the faint glow that now pulsed gently from the journal's spine. A ship under the lake. She had heard that story once, whispered by the townsfolk, about a steamer that went down in 1889, taking with it 30 souls. No one ever found it. No one ever dove deep enough, but her father had been obsessed with it, searching until the day he drowned trying to reach its wreck. She closed the journal slowly, the edges damp from her fingers. "Papa," she murmured, "you sent him there, didn't you?" The lamp flickered. A draft passed through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of tobacco, her father's old pipe, the one that used to rest by his chair downstairs. The air grew colder. And then, faintly, the whisper returned, not from the window, but from the walls themselves. "He's still there, Eleanor." The voice was male, distant, hollow, as though carried through the beams of the house. She rose, gripping her cane. Where, she asked softly, "where is he?" The whisper sighed through the hall, through the floorboards, down into the heart of the house, beneath the window, beneath the water. Her breath trembled. She turned toward the glass once more. The rain outside had slowed, falling now in silver threads. For the first time, she noticed something, the faint outline of what looked like lanterns glimmering far out on the lake. Tiny points of light drifting over the water's surface, swaying in the mist. She had seen those once before, when she was 16, the night after her father's funeral. No one else had noticed them. Lanterns for the lost. Her mother had said, they only appear for those who still wait. Mrs. Delaney pressed her hand to the window. The light on the lake flickered, as even and swear. The whisper faded back into the rain, and though she could no longer tell if she was awake or dreaming, she smiled faintly, because somewhere beyond the storm, the past had begun to remember her too. The storm had gentled into a steady drizzle, the kind of rain that seemed to breathe with the land, whispering against the leaves and shingles. Mrs. Delaney stood before the window, the reflection of her own eyes merging with the dim shimmer of the lanterns floating far out on the lake. Their light trembled, small and patient, like souls too shy to return home. She pressed a palm against the glass, and for the first time in years, she felt something calling her beyond the comfort of her walls. Not fear, not loneliness, but invitation. The whisper had grown silent now, as if waiting for her choice. She turned from the window, wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and made her way toward the door. The air in the hallway was cool, tinged with the faint scent of cedar and dust. Each step she took stirred memories, the laughter of a child, the echo of her mother's voice humming in the kitchen, the way her father used to pause at this very doorway to light his pipe before heading out into the night. Her cane tapped softly across the floor, steady and slow, like a metronome guiding her through time. At the door, she hesitated. The rain glistened on the glass panes, and for a heartbeat she saw the house as it once was, bright, filled with voices, warm as summer honey. Then it was gone, replaced by the cool hush of the present. She opened the door. The wind met her like an old friend, cool fingers brushing against her face, carrying the scent of pine, soil, and rain-soaked wood. She stepped out onto the porch, her shawl fluttering, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp wood. The lanterns on the lake swayed gently in the mist, their faint golden light drawing her forward. She descended the steps one at a time, careful and slow. The world outside was alive with sound, the sigh of the trees, the rhythmic patter of raindrops, the occasional low croak of a frog hidden somewhere in the reeds. Fireflies blinked faintly between the shadows, as if hesitant to intrude upon this quiet pilgrimage. The path to the lake had long grown over, choked with ivy and wild fern, but she knew every bend by heart. Her cane brushed aside the wet leaves as she walked, and beneath the rhythm of her footsteps came the faintest echo. Another set of steps, lighter, almost childlike, following a few paces behind. She didn't turn. She only smiled. "Thomas!" she whispered, and the air seemed to warm around her. As she reached the edge of the water, the lanterns appeared clearer now. Not reflections, not tricks of mist, but true lights, their glow pulsing softly in rhythm with the ripples. There were 12 of them, drifting in a slow circle, like mourners in an endless vigil. She knelt as far as her body allowed, feeling the chill of wet earth beneath her knees. Her reflection wavered on the water's surface, but beside it, faintly, was another, a boy no older than 10, eyes bright, hair plastered to his forehead by rain. He smiled at her. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. "I waited," he said softly, though his lips didn't move. "I know," she answered. "Tears lost in the rain. You always did." The lanterns drifted closer, their light touching her hands, the glow seeping through her skin like warmth remembered. Beneath the surface, something shimmered, faint shapes of what might have been a ship's railing, or a staircase leading downward into the deep. The water rippled once, and she thought she heard the creak of timbers, the distant toll of a bell. The last steamer. Her father's ghost, her brother's laughter, the house's whisper. All of it converged in that moment, soft as rain against the skin. Then the boy's reflection leaned closer, his voice like wind through a curtain. "It's all right. Now, Ellie, you can come home." She closed her eyes. Around her, the storm fell quiet. The lake turned glass smooth, and the lanterns flickered once before fading, one by one, into the mist. Behind her, far up the hill, the Delaney house stood in silence, its windows glowing faintly as though lit from within by memory itself. The old clock chimed once, a single, clear note that drifted across the water like a sigh. Mrs. Delaney opened her eyes. The world felt lighter, as if something had finally exhaled after decades of holding breath. She smiled faintly, her voice a whisper barely louder than the rain. I remember now." The wind carried her words out across the lake, where they dissolved into stillness. Morning crept softly over Waverley Hollow, pale and uncertain, as if the dawn itself feared to disturb the hush left behind by the storm. The rain had stopped some time before sunrise, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. The lake was still, a sheet of silver glass beneath the sky streaked with low clouds. Mist clung to the shoreline, curling around the reeds and stones like breath that refused to fade. From the narrow road that wound past the Delaney property, the house appeared unchanged. The same sagging roof, the same cracked paint, the same lonely silhouette standing guard over the water. Yet something about it felt ... awake. The windows glimmered faintly in the morning light, as though they had been washed clean from within. Mr. Caldwell The postman was the first to notice. He had delivered letters to that house for 20 years, though no one ever answered the door anymore. Most mornings he left the mail wedged between the porch railings, his footsteps echoing through the empty yard. But today, when he approached the gate, he stopped. The path, once tangled with ivy, had been cleared. The air smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke, like it used to when old Mrs. Delaney would bake bread on rainy days. "Well, I'll be," he muttered under his breath, tipping his hat back. He stepped onto the porch. The boards, usually creaking, were silent beneath his boots. The front door was slightly ajar, the faintest crack, enough for the morning breeze to stir the lace curtain within. "Señora Delaney," he called softly. No answer, only the steady drip of rainwater from the eaves. He hesitated, then nudged the door open. The hinges didn't groan this time. They moved easily, as if freshly oiled. Inside, the house was bathed in a soft golden light. The smell of damp wood and dust had been replaced by something warm and sweet. Beeswax, perhaps, and lilac. The sitting room looked lived in. The lamp still glowed faintly, though it shouldn't have. The electricity had been cut off months ago. On the table beside the armchair lay a blue shawl, neatly folded. The knitting needles rested beside it, the yarn wound into a perfect ball. But the chair itself was empty. Mr. Caldwell stepped further in, removing his cap. "Señora Delaney," he repeated, quieter now. His eyes fell upon the window, the same window that faced the lake. The glass was clear, spotless, though the rain had beaten it all night. On the inside of the pane, faint but visible, was a single handprint. Small, child-sized. He stood frozen for a moment, a shiver passing through him, despite the warmth in the room. Then he noticed the open door at the back, the one leading toward the path down to the lake. Through it, he could see the mist rolling low, silver and soft. Something glimmered near the water's edge. He stepped out slowly, his boots sinking into the damp grass. As he neared the shore, he stopped again. The lake was calm, untouched, but in the shallow water, right where the lanterns might have drifted, 12 small candles floated in a perfect circle, their flames flickering though there was no wind. In the center of that circle, something lay beneath the surface, a glint of metal, a shape long buried, but now revealed by the receding storm. It looked like the rusted curve of a ship's railing. Mr. Caldwell knelt, staring, his reflection wavering beside it. He thought he heard something, a faint voice, barely audible over the hush of the morning. It might have been the breeze through the reeds, or the sigh of the lake itself. "She's home now," it seemed to say. When he looked up, the mist had lifted slightly, revealing the outline of a woman standing on the far bank, tall, wrapped in blue, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of a boy. They watched him for a moment before fading back into the fog. He remained kneeling long after they were gone, his cap clutched in his hands. Later that afternoon, when the townsfolk came searching, they found the door of the Delaney house closed once more, the curtains drawn. Telampdar. No one ever saw Mrs. Delaney again. But when the rain returned weeks later, those who passed by swore they could see a faint glow in the upper window, and if the night was quiet enough, a soft humming, that sounded very much like a lullaby. When the night returns to Waverly Hollow, the lake glows faintly beneath the moon, and the wind carries the same old song that has drifted across its surface for generations. Those who listen closely. The late wanderers, the sleepless, the dreamers, sometimes say they can still hear a voice near the Delaney house, not loud, not frightening, just a whisper that moves through the glass and the rain. Perhaps it is only memory breathing, or perhaps some stories never truly end. I am Evelyn Blackwood, and tonight, as the rain resumes its gentle rhythm, we leave behind the quiet life of Mrs. Eleanor Delaney, a woman who waited 70 years to hear her name whispered once more. Her house still stands on the edge of the lake, though its doors remain closed and the ivy has begun to reclaim the porch. Some evenings, a soft golden light flickers in the window, and if the night is calm enough, the sound of knitting needles can be heard, steady as rainfall. The townsfolk no longer speak of it aloud, yet no one dares to pass by. After dusk, there's a superstition now, whispered among the children, that if you stand before that window during a storm and call her name, you'll hear the answer of someone who remembers you, even if the world has forgotten. They say it's the same whisper that once called her, the same voice that led her into the rain, where the past and the present finally met beneath the lantern light. The Delaney name has become a part of Waverly Hollow's quiet folklore, a reminder of what the rain can keep and what it can return. But sometimes, when I tell this story on nights like this, I think it isn't about ghosts at all. I think it's about memory itself. How it clings to walls and windows. How it hums softly even after the people have gone. The rain has always been a keeper of such things. It falls upon the living and the dead alike, washing away years, blurring the edges between then and now, between here and what was lost. So if you find yourself awake one stormy night, listening to the rain outside your own window, don't be afraid of the whispers. They are only echoes of love that refuse to fade. Let them pass through you gently, like breath, like time, like sleep. And as the house of Delaney fades once more into the mist, know that every storm carries a story, and every story, in the end, comes home. The rain deepens, soft and unbroken. The world narrows to sound and shadow, and you, my dear listener, may let go now. Close your eyes. Feel the weight of the night rest against your skin. Hear the soft murmur of the window beside you. Perhaps it too. The rain had not stopped in 3 days when Lydia Moren arrived at Waverly Hollow. She was a quiet woman in her 30s, carrying 2 leather-bound notebooks, a tape recorder wrapped in cloth, and a heart that had grown used to chasing stories others had long forgotten. As a folklore researcher from Boston University, Lydia had spent years collecting fragments of American small-town legends, the kind of whispers that drifted between truth and imagination. Yet something about the Delaney story had followed her, finding its way into her dreams. It began with a letter she received last autumn, unsigned, written in an ink that had bled slightly through the paper. If you wish to understand what the rain remembers, come to the hollow before winter. The house still listens. She hadn't known what it meant, but it felt like an invitation written by time itself. So here she was, standing before the Delaney house, where fog curled around the porch and ivy clung to the shutters like veins of memory. The window everyone in town warned her about stood half open, the laced curtain breathing softly in the damp wind. The air smelled of cedar and rain-soaked earth. When Lydia stepped inside, the floor sighed beneath her feet, as though the house recognized the weight of another soul entering its silence. She moved slowly through the rooms, taking photographs, murmuring notes into her recorder. Her voice, calm and steady, echoed faintly. Local accounts suggest apparitions seen near the lake window. Phenomena include faint voices, flickering lights, and a recurring scent of lavender. Her words were professional, detached, but inside her something trembled, for she could feel a presence, not menacing, but observant, like a memory waiting to be acknowledged. In te parla. An old chair faced the window. A grey shawl rested on its back, its threads glimmering faintly in the muted light. Lydia reached out, hesitated, then touched it. It was warm. She withdrew her hand instantly, staring at her fingers as though they'd brushed through time itself. Outside, the rain thickened. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled once, low and mournful. Lydia opened her notebook, writing quickly. The house retains thermal resonance inconsistent with environmental temperature. Possible explanation: structural insulation, anomaly. But even she didn't believe her own rationalization. She had studied hauntings before, and most dissolve under science. But this one hummed. That night, she stayed at the Hollow Inn, a small establishment owned by a widower named Mr. Kemp, who spoke softly and avoided eye contact. When she mentioned the Delaney house, he only shook his head. Best not to dig too deep, Miss Moren. Some stories don't like to be found. Lydia smiled politely, pretending not to notice the tremor in his hand as he slid her the room key. Her window overlooked the lake. At midnight, she woke suddenly to a sound, not thunder, not footsteps, but a voice just beyond the glass. A whisper, delicate as silk, saying her name. Lydia. The rain pressed harder against the window pane. She sat up slowly, her heart steady but cold. The voice came again, closer this time, almost inside the room. You came back. She froze. The room was empty, yet the air shimmered faintly near the curtains. Her reflection in the window was pale, almost transparent, as if the glass couldn't decide who it was showing. She whispered back, though she didn't know why. Who are you? The rain pause said, a single heartbeat of silence, and then the whisper returned, no louder, but clearer. You know me. The words rippled through her chest, like the echo of a dream she'd forgotten upon waking. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the presence was gone. The night fell back into its steady rhythm of rain. Lydia exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. She pressed record and spoke softly into her device. Day 1. Possible auditory hallucination associated with suggestion and isolation. Emotional response: moderate. Subjective interpretation, memory resonance phenomenon. But her voice wavered on the last word. She looked once more toward the lake, where a faint light flickered on the shore. just like the stories said. For a long time, she sat in silence, listening. The rain whispered against the window, and for a moment, Lydia thought she heard another voice layered within it, a woman's voice, humming an old lullaby, a song from another century. She closed her notebook, turned off the recorder, and whispered into the dark. Tomorrow, I'll go back. Outside, the lake held its breath. Inside, the air moved gently, like someone had sighed. The house at the edge of the hollow was waiting, and so was whatever had remembered her name before she ever arrived. The morning after the whisper, Waverley Hollow woke beneath a low grey sky. The rain had softened into mist, curling through the trees and drifting across the lake like a breath that refused to vanish. Lydia Moren sat at the end's small breakfast table, her notebook open beside a half-finished cup of coffee gone cold. She had not slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the window of the Delaney house, the faint light flickering behind it, and heard the voice that had known her name. She told herself it was exhaustion, suggestion, the mind's echo playing tricks after too many sleepless nights of research. Yet a quiet ache followed her, a pull, as though the hollow itself wanted her to listen more closely. She decided to return to the Delaney house before noon. Mr. Kemp, the innkeeper, caught sight of her as she passed the front desk and frowned. "You're going back out there?" he asked quietly, his voice frayed with concern. Lydia nodded. "I need to document the architecture, the artifacts, and the local accounts. It's part of my work." Mr. Kemp hesitated. "Sometimes work can call you places you shouldn't go." Then, after a long pause, he added, "If the rain starts again, don't stay past dusk. The house changes when the light goes." She thanked him, though she wasn't sure what he meant, and stepped outside. The path to the house wound through the woods, where the smell of pine and wet earth mixed with something faintly floral lavender, again drifting on the air. Lydia's shoes sank softly into the mossy ground. Somewhere above her, a crow called once and then fell silent. When she reached the lake, she stopped to catch her breath. The water lay still and silver, mirroring the clouds. The Delaney house stood on the opposite bank, quiet and waiting. As she approached, she noticed a new detail. She hadn't seen before they nisi ed carved faintly into the wooden frame of the front porch. She brushed the moss away with her fingertips. Eleanor Delaney. The carving was shallow but deliberate, as though it had been made in secret. Lydia traced the letters again, her pulse quickening. Inside, the air was cooler than the day before. She moved through each room slowly, her recorder running, the faint hum of its tape, a comfort against the silence. In the parlor she found a wooden box beneath the chair where the shawl had rested. Inside lay a stack of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, written in black ink that had turned brown with age. The top letter was addressed to my dearest, Lydia, Frosse, initials. She unfolded it with trembling hands. The letter read, "If you find this, it means the circle has turned again. I hear you in the rain sometimes, the sound of your steps, the way you pause before the window. Do not be afraid. The house remembers because we made it. Remember, there was no signature, only a small pressed violet, dry but perfectly preserved. Lydia's throat tightened. The rational part of her mind screamed for explanation. Coincidence? Pareidolia? Archival contamination? But something deeper inside her already knew it was none of those. She placed the letter carefully back into the box and sat down, the creak of the chair echoing like a sigh. Outside, the mist thickened. She turned the recorder toward the window and whispered, "If you're still here, I'm listening." At first, there was nothing but the sound of wind and distant rain. Then, faintly, like a melody rising from water, came the voice again, softer this time, yet unmistakable. "You've always been listening." Lydia's hand trembled, but she kept the recorder running. "Who are you? Say, ask it." The whisper came again, slower, almost kind. "Not who. When." The air chilled around her. The shawl lifted slightly on the chair's arm, moved by no visible breeze. She felt tears welling, though she didn't understand why. Somewhere in her mind, an image flickered, a woman standing by the same window in another century, turning to look out at the rain, her eyes filled with the same quiet longing. Lydia rose, her pulse unsteady. She whispered again, barely audible, "Eleanor?" No answer, only the rain beginning to fall once more, tapping against the glass in a rhythm almost like words. She left the recorder on the table and stepped closer to the window. For a moment, her reflection blurred, replaced by another. A woman with graying hair, gentle eyes, and a faint smile, mirroring her perfectly. Then the vision faded, and Lydia found herself alone again, the rain whispering against the glass. She pressed her palm to the window pane, and it was warm, just like the shawl had been. The warmth pulsed once, then stilled. Lydia closed her eyes. Somewhere outside, the crow called again. Somewhere beyond that, a clock struck 3. She picked up her recorder, her voice barely more than breath. "They, too." Phenomena confirmed. Subjective impression. Recognition. "I think she knows me." By the third morning in Waverley Hollow, the air carried a stillness that seemed to hum beneath the rain. Lydia Moren awoke to the faint sound of dripping water from the eaves outside her room. The rhythm steady, almost met. She felt as though she hadn't truly slept at all, only drifted between moments, between time. Her dreams filled with the same voice, whispering through endless corridors of rain. The letter to L.M. lay open on her nightstand, its ink faint but unyielding. She had read it more than a dozen times, each reading revealing something new she hadn't noticed before. The careful loops of the handwriting, the soft pressure of the pen in certain words, as though the writer had been trembling. "The house remembers because we made it remember." Lydia traced the sentence again with her fingertip, her breath fogging faintly in the cold air. What did it mean? We? She dressed quietly, packed her recorder, and left the inn without breakfast. The streets were slick with rain, and the sound of her boots echoed softly against the cobblestone. Along the way, she stopped by the Waverley Historical Society, narrow building that smelled of dust and cedar, its shelves lined with brittle archives of forgotten lives. The curator, a thin elderly man named Mr. Whitlow, greeted her with polite curiosity. When she asked for records related to the Delaney family, his expression shifted subtly, something between recognition and caution. "Eleanor Delaney," he murmured, rifling through drawers of brittle index cards. "Widowed in 1913. Lived near the lake until her passing, though no one ever found a certificate of death. Some say she simply stayed." He looked up at Lydia. "Why do you ask?" "I'm researching her story," Lydia replied, carefully choosing her tone. "And I believe she left behind letters, one of which mentions someone with my initials." Mr. Whitlow blinked slowly, then pulled a slim leather ledger from a shelf. "You're not the first Moran to come asking," he said softly. "Your great-grandmother, Lydia Moren, visited the Hollow in 1948. She stayed only 3 days, left a donation for the preservation of the Delaney property, and disappeared the following spring. Her name's in our records." Lydia froze, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. She had never heard of a Lillian Moren. "Do you know why she came?" she asked. Mr. Whitlow shook his head. "She said she was looking for someone, but the only thing she left behind was a page torn from her diary." He reached into a file and handed her a fragile sheet, sealed in protective glassine. The writing, though faded, was unmistakable, the same looping hand as the letter she'd found in the house. The entry read, "I saw her at the window today. She looked like me. Maybe the Hollow remembers through us." Lydia's heartbeat quickened. The page trembled slightly in her hands. "May I make a copy?" she whispered. "Of course," the curator said. "But, Miss Moren, if you go back to that house, remember sometimes the rain doesn't just fall. Sometimes it listens." The words followed her long after she left. When Lydia returned to the Delaney house that afternoon, the mist had thickened into a silvery veil. The lake was quiet, a single ripple moving outward from the center as if stirred by an unseen hand. Inside, the air greeted her with the faint scent of lavender and thyme. She placed the Cupidi diary page beside the old letters on the parlor table and switched on her recorder. "Day 3, she whispered. "Confirmed link between Lillian Moren and Eleanor Delaney. Possible ancestral connection. Hypothesis. Recurring cycle of memory manifesting through bloodline." Her voice faltered slightly on the last word. She sat in Eleanor's chair by the window, the one that faced the lake, and watched the rain drift down the glass in thin, silvery trails. It almost looked alive. Then, from the reflection in the window, something stirred. It was subtle at first, a flicker, a movement in the glass that did not match her own. Lydia leaned closer. The reflection smiled. Not Eris. The woman's face was softer, older, dressed in the fashion of another century. Her eyes filled with something both sorrowful and knowing. Lydia didn't move. The woman in the window lifted her hand and placed it against the glass from the other side. Lydia mirrored her without thinking. For a moment, warmth passed between them, and Lydia felt a pulse, gentle but real. Then, faintly, a voice spoke within her mind, calm as rain. "Lillian tried to forget. You came back to remember." Lydia gasped softly, blinking, and the image was gone. Only her own pale reflection remained. She reached for the recorder, her hands trembling. "Phenomenon intensifying," she said. "Subjective experience, temporal overlap between observer and historic inhabitant. Possible hereditary imprint." Her voice broke. "She called me by name." Outside, thunder rolled distantly across the lake, soft and low. Lydia turned off the recorder, staring at the rain-streaked window where the warmth of another handprint lingered faintly beside her own. The following day arrived beneath a colorless sky, where even the sun seemed hesitant to rise. Lydia Moren awoke to the sound of steady rainfall, soft and constant, like a whisper repeating itself through time. Her body felt heavy, her pulse slowed to the rhythm of the drops against the glass. When she looked toward the window, she saw it again. The faint outline of a handprint that was not her own. It had not faded overnight. She sat up slowly, the air in the room cool and fragrant with lavender. Her mind drifted back to the reflection she'd seen the day before. The woman who had looked like her, yet older, gentler, belonging to another age. Eleanor Delaney. The thought felt less like a name and more like a memory awakening. Lydia gathered her things. The recorder, her notebook, the copied diary page, and one of the old letters tied with a blue ribbon. The world outside was wrapped in fog, the lake invisible behind its silver shroud. She walked the path to the house without feeling the distance, as if the hollow itself was carrying her there. When she entered, she didn't turn on her recorder right away. Instead, she stood in the parlor, listening. The rain on the roof, the soft creak of wood expanding in dampness. Die Faintung. Like someone quietly breathing beside her, she whispered, "I'm here." The house seemed to answer with silence so deep it almost hummed. She moved toward the window, placing the letter on the sill. Her fingers brushed the glass, and the warmth pulsed again, faint but insistent. Her eyes fluttered closed. The rain's rhythm deepened, merging with her heartbeat, slow and hypnotic. When she opened them again, the room was different. The dust was gone. The light had changed, golden, filtered through lace curtains that looked new. The scent of lavender was stronger, mixed with something else. Candle wax, tea leaves, faint perfume. Lydia turned slowly. The furniture was the same, but alive. The shawl was no longer grey, but cream-white and freshly folded. A clock ticked gently on the mantel, and from the adjoining room came the sound of footsteps. Lydia's breath caught. She turned just as a woman entered, the same woman from the window. Her hair swept neatly into a bun, her eyes kind and impossibly familiar. "Oh," the woman said softly, pausing mid-step. "You're early today." Lydia couldn't move. Her voice came out as a whisper. "Eleanor? Eleanor." The woman smiled, puzzled. "You know my name." She moved closer, her presence calm, unthreatening, like sunlight and quiet water. Lydia felt her knees weaken. "What is this?" "Se," murmured. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, as if studying her reflection. "This is home, dear. Where else would you be?" Lydia looked down at her hands. They were trembling, and yet the room felt solid, real. She could smell the tea, hear the tick of the clock, feel the softness of the carpet beneath her shoes. I shouldn't be here," she said, though the words sounded hollow. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You've always been here, in some way." She moved to the window and looked out at the rain. "It's strange, isn't it? How the storm never leaves this place. Some days I think it's the sky remembering." Lydia swallowed hard. You're not alive." Eleanor turned, her expression gentle but firm. "Neither are you. When you dream," the words rippled through the air like a wave, bending light and sound around them. The room dimmed. The golden glow shifted to grey. Lydia blinked, and for an instant she saw the two of them reflected in the window, two women of different centuries standing side by side, their faces overlapping like two pages pressed together. The vision wavered, and suddenly she was alone again, the house returning to its abandoned state. Dust, shadows, silence. Her knees gave out, and she fell against the chair. Her breath came uneven, her chest tight. The recorder lay on the floor, its red light still blinking. She picked it up with trembling hands, pressing play. A voice emerged, not hers, not the usual hiss of rain, but Eleanor's, soft and clear. "You came back, as promised. The window remembers us both." Lydia froze. The tape continued to play, whispering things she hadn't recorded. Fragments of conversation, the clink of teacups, the hum of rain on a roof that no longer existed. Her heartbeat quickened. She pressed stop, but the voice continued, faintly, even after the device fell silent. "Find what we left behind, Lydia, before the rain forgets." The room grew colder. The window rattled slightly, though no wind touched it. She turned to face it, the faint imprint of two hands now visible on the glass, hers and another, perfectly aligned. Lydia whispered, "What did we leave behind?" The house did not answer, but in the reflection of the rain, she thought she saw a faint glimmer, a shadow of a small locked chest beneath the floorboards. The whisper lingered long after it faded, curling through Lydia Moren's thoughts like smoke that refused to dissipate. She stood before the window of the Delaney house, her reflection trembling in the glass, and beneath the rhythmic murmur of rain she could almost hear a pulsar. Soft, steady heartbeat that did not belong to her. Her eyes drifted down to the faint glimmer beneath the floorboards, the place where the reflection had shown a shadow of something hidden. She knelt slowly, brushing away the thin layer of dust. The boards felt uneven under her fingers, the wood swollen with age and dampness. One corner shifted slightly when she pressed. She retrieved a small penknife from her satchel and slid it into the gap. With a muted creak, the plank lifted, revealing a hollow space below. The scent that rose from it was old and earthy, tinged with lavender, ink, and iron. Inside lay a small wooden chest, about the size of a jewelry box, its surface dark with time, but its brass latch still faintly gleaming. Lydia hesitated before touching it. The air in the room had changed. The rain sounded muffled now, like it had moved further away, and the faint warmth she'd felt before the window had spread into her hands. She unlatched the box slowly. Inside, wrapped in delicate linen, was a leather-bound journal, its cover soft and worn, the initials E.D. etched faintly into the corner. Beneath it rested a silver locket and a folded photograph so fragile that the edges crumbled slightly as she lifted it. The image showed a young woman standing beside another both by the lake, both smiling faintly. One was Eleanor Delaney, the other looked exactly like Lydia. She felt the air leave her lungs. The journal trembled in her grip as she opened it to the first page. The handwriting was precise and graceful, but the ink had bled into the paper over time. "Do whoever finds this know that the rain keeps what the heart cannot." Lydia turned the pages carefully. I write these words as the storm returns. He has not come home, and I do not believe he ever will. They said the ship was lost beyond the coast, but I feel him near me still. Some nights I hear him at the window. Some nights, I answer. Lydia swallowed hard. The entries continued through the months Elano. Speaking of isolation, of voices that echoed through the house, of how she began to write letters to the rain just to feel less alone. It listens, one entry read, and when I speak, it whispers back. At first, it said my name. Then, it said, another Lillian, Lydia Frosse. That was her great-grandmother. The journal trembled in her hands. The rain carries memory, Eleanor had written. It remembers through us, through our blood. Each generation will hear it again until the circle closes. Lydia turned another page, her breath shallow. The ink grew darker, the handwriting less steady. Tonight, I saw her my reflection, but not mine. She stood where I am standing now, wearing clothes I do not recognize, her eyes filled with the same sorrow I feel. She called me by name. Lydia's pulse quickened. She was reading about herself. If she returns, tell her not to follow too deeply. The last entry read, for memory is a tide, and those who sink beneath it do not always come back. The final line was smeared, as though written with shaken hands. The rain outside began to fall harder, drumming against the roof in slow, deliberate rhythm. The air seemed alive now, charged with something between electricity and remembrance. Lydia looked toward. The window unfroze. A figure stooped on the other side, framed in silver light, its outline blurred by rain. It was Eleanor. Her face calm, her expression almost tender. She lifted her hand and pointed toward the lake. The gesture was neither warning nor invitation, but something in between. Lydia rose, the journal clutched to her chest. She whispered, "What do you want me to see?" The figure's lips moved, though Lydia heard no sound, only the hiss of rain and the faint echo of her own heartbeat. Then, faintly, through the recorder she had left running, came a voice. "The truth sleeps beneath the water." The lights in the house flickered, dimmed, then steadied. The window pane fogged slightly, and when Lydia stepped closer, the figure was gone. Only her reflection remained, pale and uncertain. She glanced down at the journal again and noticed something she hadn't before: a small map drawn on the back cover, showing the outline of the lake and a tiny mark near its northern edge. Beneath it, a single word was written: remembrance. The air in the house grew colder. Lydia closed the box carefully, tucking the locket and photo inside. As she replaced the floorboard, she whispered, "I'll find it." The wind stirred softly through the cracks of the old house, and somewhere in that sound she could almost hear Eleanor's reply. "Then you'll remember us all." The rain eased into a gentle murmur once more, as if satisfied. Lydia stood for a long moment in silence, her reflection flickering faintly beside the empty window. The rain had softened into a steady hush by the time Lydia stepped outside, clutching the old journal against her chest. The air smelled of wet cedar and iron, of things forgotten too long beneath the weight of water. The lantern in her hand cast a faint amber glow that trembled across the mist, barely reaching the edge of the overgrown path. Beyond it lay the Lake Ceylon, waiting, patient as memory. She followed the map drawn in Eleanor's hand, her boots sinking into the sodden earth. Each step felt slower than the last, as though the night itself resisted her movement. The trees whispered as she passed, their branches swaying in rhythm with her heartbeat. Somewhere behind her, the house loomed faintly, its windows reflecting nothing but darkness. The world felt folded in on itself, like she was walking inside a memory instead of across ground. When she reached the water's edge, the fog had thickened, swirling around her ankles like breath. She could see the faint outline of the small island near the center of the lake, the one marked on the map. A rickety wooden boat rested by the dock, half submerged but still tethered by a frayed rope. Lydia hesitated, then stepped in. The wood creaked beneath her, but it held with slow, deliberate pushes of the oar. She began to glide across the lake. The surface rippled softly, reflecting the dull glow of her lantern, and every now and then she thought she saw movement beneath a shimmer of something pale, drifting just below the surface. The sound of rain grew distant, fading until all she could hear was the gentle dip of the oar and her own breathing. She remembered the words from the journal. The truth sleeps beneath the water. When the boat touched the shallow shore of the island, Lydia stepped out carefully, her lantern flickering in the mist. The ground was covered with moss and reeds, and at the center of it stood a single willow tree, its branches bending low like arms reaching toward the lake. Beneath it, half buried in mud, was a small stone marker, worn smooth by years of rain. She knelt before it, brushing away the moss, until the engraving came into view. Eleanor Delaney, 1897 to 1936. A hush fell over the island. The air pressed close, thick with the scent of rain-soaked soil. Lydia opened the journal again, flipping to the final page she hadn't noticed before. It was written in a different ink, fainter, trembling. When she comes, tell her the rain is kind. Tell her the silence is safe. Tell her I forgive. Her vision blurred as tears mingled with the drizzle. She whispered softly, Eleanor, I found you. The wind shifted. The branches of the willow shivered, releasing a soft cascade of water droplets that fell like tiny sighs around her. And then she heard it, a whisper so faint she thought it might be the breeze. But it grew clearer. Words formed from mist and rain. Lydia, thank you. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, as though the lake itself spoke her name. The lantern flickered again, its light reflecting across the rippling surface where a faint silhouette had appeared. Eleanor stood there, translucent, serene, her long dress drifting like current. Her eyes were soft, filled with a sadness too deep for language. Lydia took a step forward, her hand trembling. Why me? She whispered. Eleanor's voice was barely sound, more vibration, more echo. Because you remembered. The ghost's hand lifted toward the locket Lydia wore now, the one from the box. It glowed faintly in the lantern light. Eleanor continued, the rain keeps the stories that love cannot finish. Now it's yours to set free. The lake shimmered, the air humming with an almost musical resonance, and as Lydia looked down, she saw reflections of others beneath the water faces, blurred but familiar, all looking upward with quiet peace. Generations, perhaps, of those who had heard the whispers before. Her chest tightened, but not with fear. There was warmth now, and a strange calm spreading through her body, as though something that had waited lifetimes had finally found rest. She nodded once, and as she did, the mist around Eleanor dissolved into the rain. The lantern's light steadied, golden and soft. Lydia whispered into the night, "I'll tell your story." A hush answered her, the kind of silence that feels like understanding. When she returned to the shore, dawn had begun to rise, pale silver through the thinning fog. The house across the lake looked different, now less foreboding, almost peaceful, as if its walls had finally exhaled. Lydia stood watching until the last of the mist drifted away, then turned back toward the path. Each step home felt lighter. The rain, at last, had stopped. When she reached the porch, she paused and glanced once more at the window where it had all begun. Her reflection smiled faintly back at her, and just as she turned to go inside, the faintest echo of Eleanor's voice drifted through the quiet morning. "Rest now, child. The rain remembers for us both."